Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating and frankly, incredibly relevant chapter of American history.
We are. We're looking at the Anti-Federalist Papers.
Exactly. These are the arguments made back in 1787, 1788 by those who actually opposed the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And these weren't just fringe arguments. They were detailed, powerful, and as we'll see, maybe quite prophetic.
That's right. You had the Federalists, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, making their case, a very strong case, for this new government structure.
Their promise was clear, wasn't it? They said, look, this Constitution will give us a government that's energetic, balanced, but also restrained. A solution to the chaos under the Articles of Confederation.
Absolutely. But then you had this other group, writing under pseudonyms like Brutus, Cato, Federal Farmer, Centinel. And of course, you had powerful orators like Patrick Henry.
And their warning was fundamentally different. It wasn't about chaos. It was about the future. They were saying, hold on, this structure you've designed...
It looks good on paper, maybe, with its checks and balances.
Right. But it has inherent tendencies. It's built to grow. It will inevitably expand its own power.
And crucially, they predicted it would slowly chip away at the power of the individual states,
replacing eventually the idea of government by the consent of the governed people close to their rulers with this massive, distant, almost unmovable federal bureaucracy.
And the real kicker is they lost the battle in 1788. The Constitution was ratified.
But fast forward 200 plus years.
And their warnings, their specific critiques of clauses and powers, well, you read them today, and sometimes they sound eerily like modern headlines. It's quite uncanny.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack the specific flaws the Anti-Federalists pointed to. We'll look at what they saw as limitless power grants in the Constitution.
We'll definitely spend time on the judiciary, which they saw as becoming dangerously powerful and political.
The standing army issue a huge concern for them, and this fundamental problem, as they saw it, of representation being too remote from the people, which they believed would kill off local virtue and accountability.
And we'll pay special attention to Brutus. He really emerges as perhaps the most insightful, the most prophetic voice among them.
Okay, let's start with their biggest, most foundational fear: consolidation. This idea that the new system wasn't really federal, but national, and it would eventually just swallow the states whole.
Right. And the naming itself is ironic, isn't it? Anti-Federalist No points this out. The supporters of the Constitution call themselves Federalists,
implying a system where states retain significant power.
Exactly. But the Anti-Federalists argued, wait a minute, a true federal system is more like a league, a confederacy, where the central government acts on the states. They said, we, the opponents, are the real Federalists.
And the people pushing the Constitution.
They called them national men, because the proposed system created a government that could act directly on individual citizens, tax them, make laws for them, raise armies from them.
Bypassing the state governments entirely.
Precisely. And that distinction for them was everything. Once the federal government had that direct line to the individual, the sovereignty of the states was fundamentally compromised almost from day one.
How did they see this happening structurally? What was the mechanism?
Taxation was front and center. George Mason, a really key figure, put it bluntly. He's quoted in Anti-Federalist number 35. He said, the power granted to the new federal government to levy direct taxes on individuals and property within the states instantly changes the game. It transforms the government from a confederation into one consolidated government.
He thought state and federal taxes couldn't coexist.
He argued they couldn't coexist for long. Because the federal government's power would be supreme, it would inevitably starve the states of revenue, making them dependent and ultimately destroying their financial independence.
Okay, so the taxing power is key, but what makes the federal power supreme? This is where those famous clauses come in, right? The ones they're really worried about.
Exactly. The Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause. They saw these two working together as the engine that would drive this consolidation.
Let's break that down. The Necessary and Proper Clause says Congress can make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its listed powers. Sounds reasonable on the surface, maybe.
Well, the Anti-Federalists ask the crucial question, who gets to decide what's necessary and proper?
Congress itself.
That's what they argued. Brutus and another writer, an old Whig, said, Congress will inevitably be the judge of its own powers. And if Congress decides something is necessary, who can stop them?
Now hold on, because the Federalists had an answer here, didn't they? They argued this clause wasn't granting new power, but just acknowledging the implied powers any government needs to function. They'd point to the failures under the Articles and say, see, the government needs these tools. Why didn't the Anti-Federalists buy that argument?
It's a subtle but critical distinction they made. They saw a difference between powers that are truly implied and necessary and powers that Congress could simply declare necessary as a pretext to expand its reach.
So it's the self-judging aspect they feared.
Precisely. An old Whig argued that if Congress is the sole judge, and if the courts, as they expected, would largely defer to Congress on what's necessary, then what looks like a limited list of powers becomes effectively unlimited in practice.
Necessity becomes elastic.
Exactly. It becomes a justification for legislating on almost anything, swallowing up areas the Anti-Federalists believed should absolutely remain with the states. They predicted Congress would use it to regulate every aspect of life, placing itself beyond any real control except force. That's a direct quote.
Wow. Okay, so Congress uses necessary and proper to expand its legislative reach. Then what role does the Supremacy Clause play?
That's the enforcement hammer. Brutus, in Anti-Federalist number 16, laid it out very clearly. The Constitution and the laws made by Congress under it are declared the supreme law of the land, meaning any state constitution or state law that conflicts with federal law is null and void, instantly overridden.
So state sovereignty just evaporates.
That was their fear. It creates this direct pipeline of power, as you said, from Washington, D.C., straight to the individual citizen, completely bypassing the state legislature, making the state almost irrelevant in any area where the federal government chose to act.
Which led to some pretty biting predictions about the future of state governments.
Oh, definitely. Centinel, writing in Anti-Federalist number 8, had this incredibly memorable satirical line. He predicted the goal was for state legislatures to eventually be absorbed by our grand continental vortex.
The federal government as a vortex pulling everything in.
Yes. Or, he said, they dwindle into petty corporations and have power over little else than yoking hogs or determining the width of cartwheels.
Yoking hogs or determining the width of cartwheels? That's brutal. It really captures that sense of states being reduced to handling only the most trivial local matters.
It's incredibly powerful imagery. It's not just a legal argument. It's a lament for the loss of meaningful local self-government.
And another writer, Sidney, echoed this in Anti-Federalist number 44.
Yes, Sidney was more direct, perhaps less poetic, but just as stark. He concluded the new government would simply absorb all those powers of the state, and the result, it would destroy the rights and liberties of the people, because those rights were best protected, they believed, closer to home.
So for them, this idea of dual sovereignty, where state and federal power could peacefully coexist,
it's basically a myth, an unstable fiction. They saw it as inherently biased towards the center, destined to collapse into one dominant national power.
Okay, so that's the core fear consolidation, the end of the states as meaningful entities. Now, let's talk about the tools they believed this new government would use to achieve and maintain that dominance. You mentioned taxation and the military.
Exactly. The power of the purse and the power of the sword. They understood, fundamentally, that control over money and control over force are the keys to political power.
And on taxation, they made a really crucial distinction, one we don't talk about much today, between external and internal taxes.
That's right. Richard Henry Lee and Brutus really hammered this point home. External taxes, basically, tariffs or imposts on goods imported into the country, they saw these as naturally limited.
How so?
Well, if you set tariffs too high, merchants just won't import the goods, or they'll find ways to smuggle them in. Plus, you only needed to collect them at a few ports. Relatively easy, relatively contained.
But internal taxes were a different beast entirely.
Completely different. Brutus defined these broadly. Poll taxes, taxes on land, excise taxes on goods produced and consumed within the country, duties on legal documents, basically taxes on every necessary or conveniency of life.
Hitting everyone, everywhere.
Yes, affecting every single person, every piece of property. And crucially, they saw this power as inherently unlimited. Congress could tax anything at any level it chose.
And this, Brutus warned, wasn't just about raising revenue.
No. He called this unlimited power of internal taxation the great engine of oppression and tyranny. Because to actually collect these taxes across such a vast country,
you need an army of officials.
Precisely. He warned it would necessitate a swarm of revenue and excise collectors to prey upon the honest and industrious part of the community. Think about that imagery, a swarm like locusts.
And this wasn't just theoretical paranoia, was it? They had recent experience.
Very recent, very bitter experience with British tax collectors. Centinel, in Anti-Federalist number 29, drew directly on that memory. He described these future federal collectors in really harsh terms, the very scum and refuse of mankind.
Strong words.
And he described their powers entering homes, breaking down doors, searching people's clothing for untaxed items. This wasn't just about money. It was about the violation of privacy, the sanctity of the home, the dignity of the citizen. It was a moral objection to intrusive government power.
So the power of the purse fuels this intrusive bureaucracy. How does the power of the sword, the military, fit in?
They saw it as directly connected. You need force to back up these kinds of pervasive laws and taxes, especially if people resist. And the Constitution gave Congress the power to raise and support armies with very few restrictions.
Which went against a long-held belief in the colonies, right?
Absolutely. Brutus stated it plainly in Anti-Federalist number 24. It was basically an axiom in America, long understood. Standing armies, permanent professional armies kept in peacetime, are dangerous to liberty.
Why? What was the alternative?
The ideal was the citizen militia, a well-regulated militia, ordinary citizens organized for defense, answering to local or state authority. They believed a republic, based on consent and virtue, shouldn't need a permanent internal military force separate from the people themselves.
But the Constitution allowed for one. And Brutus predicted how it would be justified, didn't he?
Yes, and this is chillingly prescient. He saw the justification trap. He predicted advocates for the army would constantly point to plausible reasons. Dangers from Native Americans on the frontier. Threats from European powers like Britain or Spain in neighboring territories.
Always an external threat.
Always an external threat, real or potential. And because these threats could be portrayed as permanent, the need for the army would become perpetual too. It creates a rationale that never goes away, making it almost impossible to argue for disbanding the army later.
Were they drawing on history here?
Heavily. Anti-Federalist 25 specifically cites Julius Caesar using his loyal army to overthrow the Roman Republic and establish a dictatorship, and Oliver Cromwell using his new model army to seize power in Britain after their civil war.
So these weren't abstract fears, they were seeing historical patterns.
Patterns where armies, created ostensibly for defense, ended up turning on the very governments and liberties they were supposed to protect, especially if they weren't under strict civilian control and tied closely to the people.
And they also worried about the army being used internally, right, against the citizens.
Yes, Centinel warned about that explicitly in Anti-Federalist number 8. He feared Congress could use federal troops to crush dissent, labeling any popular resistance or first struggles of freedom as an insurrection that needed military suppression.
There was also concern about federal control over the state militias themselves.
Huge concern. Anti-Federalist No. 29 talks about the fear that giving Congress unqualified command over the militia could lead to the militarization of society, subjecting ordinary citizens to harsh military discipline, court-martials, even capital punishment, potentially destroying personal and civil liberties under the guise of military necessity.
It's a bleak picture, but it's important to stress they weren't just saying no. They did offer alternatives, didn't they? Especially regarding the army.
They did. Brutus, for instance, proposed a specific constitutional amendment in Anti-Federalist number 25. He suggested requiring a supermajority, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, to approve raising troops during peacetime.
Raising the bar significantly.
Right. And he argued the size should be strictly limited to only what was absolutely necessary for guards and garrisons, unless the country was facing an actual imminent foreign invasion. They understood defense was needed, but they wanted extremely high barriers against creating a permanent military state that could threaten liberty from within. Okay, so we have the legislature with potentially unlimited power via necessary and proper, backed by unlimited taxation and a standing army. What about the third branch, the judiciary?
Ah, yes, the courts. The Anti-Federalists saw this branch as perhaps the most insidious threat of all. And again, Brutus is really the key voice here, especially in his essays numbered 78 through, well, into the 80s.
He made a startling claim. He said the Supreme Court, under the proposed Constitution, would be exalted above all other power in the government and subject to no control.
Above Congress. Above the president. How?
It stemmed from the very features designed to make the judiciary independent, which, ironically, the Federalists praised.
Like life tenure.
Exactly. Judges hold office during good behavior, which effectively means for life unless they commit impeachable offenses. Brutus pointed out that treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, the standard for impeachment is a very high bar.
It doesn't cover just making bad decisions or having a lack of ability.
Precisely. He argued it specifically excludes removal for errors in judgment or want of capacity. So judges could make politically motivated rulings, expand federal power through interpretation, and face essentially no consequences, no accountability to the people or even other branches.
And their salaries were protected too.
Right. Salaries couldn't be diminished while they were in office, making them independent of Congress's power of the purse. So you have life tenure, protection from pay cuts, and a very narrow path for removal. Brutus saw this as creating an unaccountable elite.
But the real danger wasn't just their independence, it was their power, specifically the power to interpret the Constitution.
That was the core of it. The courts were authorized to decide the meaning of the Constitution and federal laws. And Brutus highlighted a critical phrase they could interpret not just according to the letter of the law, but according to its perceived spirit and intention.
Interpreting the spirit, that sounds flexible.
Dangerously flexible, in Brutus's view. He argued this power essentially elevates the judiciary above the legislature. Why? Because if the court interprets the spirit of the Constitution in a way that Congress disagrees with, Congress can't just pass a law saying, no, you misinterpreted, this is what we meant.
The court's interpretation stands.
It stands. Judicial precedent, based on their reading of the spirit, becomes the effective law of the land. It can only be overturned by a future court or through the incredibly difficult process of a constitutional amendment.
And Brutus predicted how they'd use this interpretive power.
He did. He pointed straight to the preamble of the Constitution, those broad aspirational goals: form a more perfect union, establish justice, promote the general welfare.
Goals everyone could agree on, presumably.
Yes, but Brutus warned that judges would use these vague phrases to justify interpretations that consistently give latitude to every department of the federal government. In other words, they'd use the spirit of promoting the general welfare, for example, to uphold federal laws that stretched far beyond the specific enumerated powers listed elsewhere.
All leading back to consolidation.
Exactly. He predicted the ultimate goal, conscious or not, would be the steady erosion and subversion of state powers in favor of national power, all validated by judicial decree.
How would this play out in practice? How would court decisions impact state laws?
Brutus was clear. The federal courts would have the final say on whether state laws were constitutional. Since federal law is supreme, any state law deemed by a federal court to conflict with the Constitution, or even just the court's interpretation of its spirit, would be struck down.
Making state laws, as he put it, trifling and unimportant whenever the federal government decided to step in.
Precisely. The federal judiciary becomes the ultimate arbiter of state power, staffed by judges with lifetime appointments, completely independent of state governments or state voters.
There was another very specific critique about the courts, wasn't there? Coming from Luther Martin, focused on trial by jury.
Yes, this is a bit technical, but absolutely crucial to their understanding of liberty. Luther Martin, in Anti-Federalist number 83, zeroed in on the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction.
Meaning its power to review cases from lower courts.
Right. And the Constitution said this appellate power extended to questions of both law and fact.
What's the significance of fact?
Traditionally, in the Anglo-American system, the jury's job is to determine the facts of the case. Did the person actually do the thing they're accused of? Does the evidence prove guilt? The judge handles the law.
So the jury decides what happened, the judge decides the legal consequences.
Correct. But Martin pointed out that if the Supreme Court can review and redecide the facts of a case on appeal, even after a local jury heard the witnesses and reached a verdict,
it completely undermines the jury's role.
It makes the jury verdict potentially meaningless, of no possible effect, as he put it. The findings of a local jury, representing the community's common sense, could be overturned by a panel of distant elite federal judges re-evaluating the raw facts.
Why would the framers design it that way?
Martin argued it was intentional. He believed the framers, many of whom were skeptical of too much democracy, distrusted local control. His quote was something like, "They could not trust state judges, so would they not confide in state juries?"
Wow. So it was part of the centralization plan, even centralizing the determination of basic truth.
That's how Martin saw it. Concentrating power, even over factual findings, in the hands of the federal judiciary, away from local communities and juries.
And beyond these structural issues, Brutus also raised a practical concern, didn't he? About access to justice.
Yes, in Anti-Federalist number 82, he made a very practical point. Litigating a case all the way up to the Supreme Court, likely located far away in the national capital, would be incredibly expensive.
Travel costs? Lawyers' fees?
Exactly. He predicted the cost would be so high that it would effectively put it out of the power of the poor and middling class of citizens to contest a suit in it.
So justice becomes a luxury item.
Essentially, yes. Another way the system would favor the wealthy and well-connected, further distancing the federal government and its power from the lives of ordinary people.
This theme of distance seems central to their entire critique, doesn't it? It goes beyond just the legal structures.
Absolutely. You could argue it's their deepest philosophical objection. They fundamentally disagreed with the core premise of James Madison's argument in Federalist No. 10, the idea that a large, extended republic was not only possible, but actually better at controlling factions and preserving liberty.
The Anti-Federalists thought the opposite. Size was the problem.
Yes. For them, the danger wasn't democracy itself, it was distance. A writer using the pseudonym, a farmer, put it starkly. He argued that when government authority operates over a vast extent of territory, it tends to overwhelm people. It terrifies the minds of individuals into meanness and submission.
Makes people feel small and powerless.
Exactly. The sheer scale and remoteness diminish the citizen's sense of agency. They're feeling that they can actually influence or control the government that rules them.
And the Federal Farmer writer expanded on this idea of distance eroding consent, right?
Beautifully, yes. In Anti-Federalist No. 3, he talks about the natural ties of acquaintance, habits, and fortunes that bind people to their local communities and representatives. As government gets further away, those ties weaken.
It's just common sense, he argued.
Right. He asked, is it really reasonable to expect a representative from Georgia or New Hampshire, someone you'll never meet who knows nothing of your local life, to govern your specific liberties with the same care and attachment as someone from your own town or county?
The answer seemed obvious to them.
It was no. Attachment diminishes with distance. He argued the strongest principle of union resides within our domestic walls: family, neighborhood, local community, then the state. As the circle enlarges to the national level, that natural affection and sense of shared fate weakens considerably.
This sounds like more than just a political argument. It sounds almost like a moral one.
It absolutely was. Their defense of local government wasn't just about power. It was rooted in a belief about virtue. They believed that genuine self-government requires civic virtue, self-restraint, a sense of duty to the community, active participation, and virtue, they argued, is cultivated locally.
It can't be mandated from a distance.
Exactly. Virtue can't be centralized, can't make people good or responsible by issuing decrees from a faraway capital. It has to grow organically from those local relationships and attachments. This connects to that older tradition of natural law, the idea that good government serves a pre-existing moral order.
So this distance wasn't just impractical, it was morally corrosive, and they feared it would lead to a specific kind of government.
Yes, they predicted this combination of distance and the complexity of the federal system would inevitably lead to the rise of an aristocracy, not necessarily titled lords, but a government run by a privileged elite, the well-born, disconnected from the common people.
Where did they see this aristocracy forming most clearly?
The Senate was a major focus of concern. Writers like Cato and Centinel pointed to the Senate structure. Long 6-year terms, no mandatory rotation in office, meaning senators could stay for decades, and their role in appointments and treaties.
Giving them immense power and stability separate from popular pressure.
Right. Cato flatly predicted this structure would eventually create a vile and arbitrary aristocracy or monarchy.
And Richard Henry Lee added a practical point about who could even get elected to federal office.
Yes, in Anti-Federalist No. 36. He argued that, just practically speaking, given the size of the country and the expense of campaigning and traveling to the capital, only men of the elevated classes would realistically be able to seek and hold federal office.
Especially considering the different social structures across the states.
Exactly. He contrasted what he saw as the more democratic society in the New England states with a more aristocratic, planter-dominated society in the South. He feared the national government would inevitably end up reflecting the interests and character of the elite, not the broad populace.
This really highlights the fundamental difference in philosophy between the two sides, doesn't it? The Federalists and Anti-Federalists had different ideas about what makes government work.
A profound difference. The Federalists, particularly Madison, put their faith in structure, checks and balances, separation of powers, pitting ambition against ambition, as Madison famously wrote. They believed a well-designed system could channel self-interest and prevent tyranny.
Like a well-oiled machine.
Sort of. trust the design, the mechanics, but the Anti-Federalists were deeply skeptical of that. They put their faith ultimately in virtue.
The character of the people and their representatives.
Yes. Centinel, for example, argued that all the complex checks and balances were actually a weakness. He believed true accountability comes from simplicity, a government close to the people, with clear lines of responsibility, where citizens can easily see who is making decisions and hold them accountable, vote them out if necessary.
Complexity just obscures responsibility.
That was his fear. It confuses the public, makes it harder to pinpoint blame, and ultimately shields the powerful from accountability. For them, structure could never be a substitute for the moral character of the people running it and the citizens overseeing it.
Which loops back to their moral argument.
It does. They believed law shouldn't just be about power. It had to be grounded in a moral order, in natural law. As one writer, a plebeian, argued, no constitution, no matter how clever, can replace the virtue of the citizens.
And this is why the Bill of Rights was so non-negotiable for them.
Absolutely. Luther Martin articulated this perfectly. Since power naturally flows towards the center, and since this new constitution granted such broad powers, any rights not explicitly reserved were effectively given away.
You had to spell them out.
You had to spell them out. Because they believed the combination of the necessary and proper clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the judiciary's power to interpret the spirit would eventually be used to undermine any right that wasn't explicitly protected in writing.
So reflecting on all these warnings, all these predictions, it's hard not to look at the subsequent 2 centuries and see them being right about a lot of things.
It is quite striking. Their realism, in many ways, seems to have been validated by history, often more so than the optimism of the Federalists.
Let's tick through some of the big ones. First, centralization replacing federalism.
Check. The broad interpretation of the necessary and proper clause and the Supremacy Clause, largely upheld by the judiciary, just as Brutus predicted, has allowed the federal government to regulate vast areas of life, commerce, healthcare, education, the environment areas the Anti-Federalists would have insisted belonged solely to the states.
Centinel's grand continental vortex seems to have absorbed quite a bit. State governments often feel like administrative arms of federal policy now.
Very much so. Which leads to the second point, bureaucracy replacing self-government.
Brutus's swarm of revenue and excise collectors.
It's become much more than just tax collectors. We now have a massive federal administrative state with countless agencies issuing regulations that have the force of law, staffed by professionals far removed from direct electoral accountability. It's the distant, complex government they feared.
Third, judicial edict replacing deliberative lawmaking.
Again, Brutus seems prophetic here. The courts, interpreting the spirit of the Constitution and its preamble, have made sweeping decisions on fundamental social and moral issues the Anti-Federalists believed were absolutely reserved for the people to decide through their state legislatures or local communities.
Fourth, the standing army and perpetual war footing.
Brutus warned that plausible reasons, like ongoing external threats, would be used to justify a permanent military. It's undeniable that the U.S. now maintains a massive, permanent global military presence, far beyond anything conceived in 1787, constantly engaged or prepared for engagement.
And finally, that crisis of virtue due to distance. National dependency replacing civic virtue.
This is perhaps the hardest to quantify, but maybe the most profound. The federal farmer worried about those weakening ties of acquaintance, habits, and fortunes. Has the sheer scale and remoteness of the federal government led to a citizenry that feels less connected, less responsible, more dependent on distant authorities, and less engaged in the kind of active, virtuous self-governance the Anti-Federalists saw as essential? It's a serious question their writings force us to confront.
It really does feel like they lost the vote in 1788, but maybe won the long argument. They stand as this conscience of the founding, reminding us that freedom requires limits, requires restraint.
And it's crucial to understand why they issued these warnings. It wasn't to make people despair or give up.
No, it was a call to action, wasn't it?
It was a call to vigilance, a call perhaps even for repentance, for citizens to reclaim their moral independence, their sense of responsibility for self-government. They were teaching us that the Constitution isn't magic. It's not a machine that runs itself perfectly.
It requires something from the people.
It requires constant attention, virtue, and the courage to hold power accountable. It only works, it only lives, as long as the people remain vigilant and morally grounded.
So the takeaway isn't just they predicted X, Y, and Z. It's that they identified the vulnerabilities.
They showed us where the system was likely to break down if the people weren't careful. They warned us what would happen. And in large measure, it did happen.
Which leaves us with the really challenging question they implicitly pose. Now what? Do we still have the character, the courage to try and address these imbalances, to restore some of that local control and civic virtue they prized? Or has the system become too big, too entrenched?
That is the question their legacy leaves us with. And maybe one final thought from Brutus is relevant here, from Anti-Federalist number 1.
What did he say there?
He observed something interesting about political dynamics. He said that when everyone agrees, when there's only one dominant party or opinion on major issues, that's actually when freedom is most in danger. Freedom ceases, he wrote, and despotism commences.
So disagreement, competing views are actually healthy.
Essential, according to Brutus. The Anti-Federalist legacy, in a way, is the defense of that necessary tension, the preservation of competing viewpoints, the fight for moderation against the blind passions of any single group trying to impose total uniformity. Liberty depends on that balance.
It's a powerful final thought. Their dissent, even in losing, was vital. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the often overlooked but incredibly insightful voices of the Anti-Federalists.
We hope it's given you a richer understanding of the foundations of American political thought and the enduring tension between centralized power and individual liberty.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.